arts and crafts interiors really reflect that idea of unity in style that we see from this period, whether it be Art Nouveau or arts and crafts, although we see a little bit more from arts and crafts because it's dealing with the interior space and what they saw as a need to beautify but also create useful pieces. Just looking at this basic interior, we have the use of stained glass, we have large open windows, large airy spaces, relatively large. Obviously, this isn't a mansion. We have furniture that is often going to be multifunction. So, for example, a table where you could also store some things underneath. And this is probably also an expanding table with the use of leaves. We see fireplaces that are oftentimes small and the focus of the room, but we get this very comfortable feel. So let's break down the arts and crafts interior. Now, when we go inside the Red House, which is William Morris's sort of model of what the arts and crafts can be, we see it is surrounded by art, by beautification. Everything has an aesthetic element to it. And traditionally, in the Morris sort of frame of mind, most of the furniture is massive, it's monumental, it's meant to stay with the property. It's not meant to move. And from his perspective, the designer of the house should also be able to design the furniture. So we see that throughout. We also see an interest in the medieval, which we've talked about. For example, in this screen, we see the use of gold heavily here, the use of the female form, those natural elements coming out. So a lot of the characteristics of the arts and crafts. In terms of materials, they use a lot of wood. They will use stone, but they are always going to be very honest to the material. So it will be left open. It will be left unpainted and unaltered. Sometimes that means that the wood is simply stained. Sometimes it's in its natural form. Now, during this period, we see the development of new varnishes and new preservatives for wood, so you don't have to oil the wood all the time. And they will take advantage of that and use those tools to create pieces that are going to be much easier to maintain. That being said, in an arts and crafts house, not all of the wood has to match. For example, here we have a hutch that is typical arts and crafts, very rectilinear in form, in a room where the wood, this sort of honey-colored wood, doesn't match the more matte brown that we see, almost a raw umber color that we see from the other woodwork. Walls will often use paneling in some form. Now, this can take the form of a chair rail or a plate rail, as we'll get to. They will often have bright and vibrant decorations. In the English arts and crafts. In the American arts and crafts, known as the craftsman style, that will be different. They will use wallpapers quite a bit, and these are repetitious forms, although they do have stencils and other forms that they will use as well. This is often three-dimensional. You can catch the fact that this is embossed wallpaper if you look at the reflection right here coming off of the side of it. And you'll see that the wall is generally broken into levels, usually 3 levels, very similar to the idea that we got from the Victorian, although the decor going on the walls is going to be very different. Ceilings tend to be open beam, so you can see the beams there, and then you will have plaster in between. Sometimes there will be decorative elements, sometimes there might be, for example, wood panels in between the wooden beams, but the beams have to be there, and oftentimes they're obviously not supporting. So for example, these beams don't go all the way through the wall, they just stop here, although that is often an aesthetic choice. These are simply added on to break up the ceiling, lower the ceiling, and make it simply more comfortable in the space. We will see a lot of use of what's called a plate rail and a frieze. Now, the frieze is the same idea we have from the classical world, this idea that we have a border running along the top of the wall. In arts and crafts, that is typically going to have some kind of natural motif. So here we have this idea of a sunset through the trees. And these are put out, these are very expensive wallpapers frequently that are put out. They're called mural wallpapers. And some of these can be incredibly expensive today if you can recover them or if you can find original pieces that haven't been applied yet. The plate rail is this large rail that runs around the wall, usually at about 5 feet high, but it can be a little higher or lower. And it was meant to place things. So here we have some pottery that's laid out to beautify the space. Sometimes it will be for plates. It sort of depends on who's living in the space, but there's usually going to be a bit of a toe on it. So if I look at it in profile, you're going to see the rail come out, and then there's a little toe, and that catches the edge of a plate to hold it in place so it doesn't fall off the shelf. Fireplaces will tend to be small. They will tend to be modest, but we will see the return of the inglenook from colonial America. Now here, it's not in the fireplace, it's next to the fireplace because we don't have the massive open Dutch fireplace that we saw in colonial America, but the idea is still there. Cutting off the fireplace, creating a small, very intimate, very cozy space for people to stay in, for people to be more comfortable, for reading or other pursuits. And here you see the use of columns, bringing out some of those beaux art ideas, but modifying them for arts and crafts. And then the use of the wood beams, of course, above. Colors will tend to be a little, especially in the United States, will tend to be pastel. They'll be a little bit subdued. So we're not going to see the really deep colors that we've seen otherwise. Now in England, that's a little different because William Morris believes in the use of brighter colors on many of his examples. But in the US, especially when we look at people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who will be heavily influenced by this, we will see the use of those muted tones. The idea is it gives a sense of neutrality. Everyone is comfortable moving into the space. Even if you don't really like the color, it doesn't affect you that much because it is going to be subdued. It also plays well with the natural wood furniture because, of course, the color of wood furniture tends to be a little bit subdued, so you don't want an overpowering wall if you're not going to create a very dark furniture piece, for example. And kitchens tend to be small, but they are very functional, and they're going to become increasingly functional, especially in arts and crafts, because we're moving away from the Victorian, where you would expect servants to be using the kitchen. The kitchen will be set aside somewhere else, where it's not necessarily the focal point of the house. Whereas in arts and crafts, it's going to slowly become more and more a focal point. Now, obviously, this is a modern example, but you get the idea. It's a small, intimate space, but a very, very functional space, and the dining area is very close. We will see this a lot in the craftsman-style homes in the United States.